Hi everyone, I'm with Dennis Altman here. My name's Carolyn de Cruz. We've both been involved into our third year now, a big fat idea around the commemoration of a book that Dennis wrote over 40 years ago. Published in 1971 in the States, 1972 in Australia, Homosexual, Oppression and Liberation gave us the chance to run a conference about the book. And we're also producing an anthology around the book where a whole host of people are describing their first encounters of the book, some who were alive at the time, some who had never heard of Dennis, who were reading it now. And Dennis is just finished editing, I think, his own book, reflecting on the 40 years. So we might start by asking the Dennis Altman of today what he might say to the Dennis Altman of 1971 who wrote the book.
You know, when I wrote the book, there was a slogan which was never trust anybody over 30. I think that probably therefore the first thing I might have to say is forget that one. I think it is a very odd situation to be in as you get older, to get in these positions where you're forced to look back and reflect on what you lived through, and to recognise that what you lived through is actually history for new generations. And just to explain, the slide comes from the opening evening of the conference, and I was enormously thrilled that two wonderful colleagues from overseas, Geoffrey Weeks from Great Britain and Alice Eccles from the United States, were brought out because luckily, Carol and the other organisers managed to find ways of making this an international conference, which is very exciting. And I think that what you can see there is actually a group of, should I say veterans? Well, that sounds a bit RSL-ish, of the gay and lesbian movement, looking back on precisely the question Carol raised. What's changed and what hasn't changed?
And what would you say would be the most significant thing that has changed in the last 40 years then?
Well, I think that the extent to which we now feel able to talk openly about homosexuality, the way in which people feel able to integrate it into their lives in at least most parts of most Western societies, because this is not universally true, is an enormous change. And I'm just going to make one very personal comment that Carol, of course, knows very well. The end of last year, my partner of 22 years died. One of the things that was very moving and enormously important was that through the whole experience of Anthony being ill, being in hospital and then dying, I was always treated as the next of kin. It was not questioned. And the interesting thing is, even in a Catholic hospital, it was taken for granted. That would have been unimaginable 40 years ago. It also, of course, related to the fact that his family accepted me as exactly the same way they accepted his sister's husbands. And those changes, I think, are enormous. I don't want to minimise the fact that a lot of homophobia, a lot of bullying, a lot of persecution, a lot of violence still exists, even in the middle of, enlightened Western rich cities. But the changes are, you reach a point where you look back and you think, this is better than we thought. I don't think we expected it to change that fast. And in fact, I see we've now moved on to another slide where I had somewhat more hair than I now have, unfortunately.
This is Dennis on the extreme right-hand side, for those of you that can't recognise the Dennis of then to the Dennis of now.
Well, and of course the great problem would be if somebody thought it was me on the left-hand side, who is in fact Germaine Greer.
But let's go back to this picture that we have in front of us now. That was 1970, and as 72, sorry. And as I understand it, it was around the launch of the Gay Liberation Front, which was in our history, which I think is part of what we're doing with commemorating the book, is recognising the importance of history that a lot of gay people sometimes aren't even interested in. So I want to reverse the question now that I asked you before. What would the Dennis Altman of 1972 there have to say about the utopic vision to today's generation and the current struggles that they have? And maybe you can also explain what the split was between the Gay Liberation Front and CAMP at the time.
Look, I don't think the split was tremendously significant. And looking back, I think that what happens is when social movements emerge, and in the early 70s, a movement around sexuality emerged, people feel the need often to make distinctions that when you look back on them are not terribly significant. We who called ourselves gay liberationists like to believe that we were more radical and more liberationist than the people who formed CAMP, which was the first major organisation of lesbians and gay men in Australia agitating for political and social change. What that image represents was a very big public event where, to be very honest, we were smart enough to capitalise on the fact that Germaine Greer was in Australia promoting the female eunuch. Huge media attention was devoted to that, and we persuaded Germaine to speak at the launch of Sydney Gay Liberation, and this is taken at the University of Sydney in 1972. The irony is that Germaine was herself not particularly comfortable with homosexuality, and so in a sense there was a...
You were very savvy.
Well, yes, this was political manipulation, you know. Where do you think Julia learnt it? No, I think that one of the things we did not anticipate was the extent to which, as more and more people came out and became comfortable with their sexuality, they would want to live lives that were based on the dominant heterosexual model. And I think this is something Carol and I might come back to at the end of the discussion, but certainly in the early 70s, we were talking sex.
And look at what we have here.
I need to explain this, and I need to pay tribute to the Lesbian and Gay Archives in Melbourne, which is really one of the great queer archives in the world. Tremendously valuable resource. What you see on the screen is a set of matchbook covers from a large number of gay male sex venues, and I want to say immediately I was not I was not avoiding lesbian sex venues, although it's doubtful that I would ever have been admitted to them.
So this is ethnographic research, is this? The collection of the matchboxes?
This is, of course, totally ethnographic, objective and detached scholarly research. We anthropologists go out and we collect objet in the field. It was really a slide that was put together to talk about the fact that at least gay male culture has a somewhat different relationship to sexuality and sex than the dominant heterosexual culture. That is, that gay male culture assumes that sexual adventure is fine, that you can be in a primary relationship and have sex outside that relationship, and that fidelity shouldn't be measured by that one yardstick.
I notice you were very careful the way you worded that, and you referred to gay male sex culture only, and we didn't hear any sort of L words.
Well, I'm going to ask you, because I think, Carol, this is where you should come in, because I know we've talked about this a lot. The reality is, even if I'd tried, I could not have found, I think, equivalent matchbooks from lesbian sex venues.
I think that's true. Yes, and I think it takes us back to the 1970s, really, where what gay men had that was different from lesbians was that lesbians were often connected to feminism, and what was going on in feminism was that women were feeling quite objectified by the dominant way in which sex was being talked about. The relations to feminism as well meant that there was a much more ambivalent or tortured relationship to sex. I think though that the venues are still not there for girls, although I think the online culture has changed things a little bit. But talking about sex and how things change sexually for people, what impact would you say that this is referring to the slide that we have up here now, AIDS had on the vision of gay liberation in the 70s to now. Can I just, explain this slide before we go on? ACT UP in Melbourne on D-Day, June 6, 1991, dismantled the floral clock with the slogan, "Time's up, we won't wait," because of the delays in getting drugs for treatments. So I'll go over to you now and talk about
I think we've got to backtrack a little bit. When HIV/AIDS first came to Australia, we were actually very well prepared. There were in fact well-organised groups in the major capital cities before there were really any cases of AIDS in Australia, and that was only possible because there had been over a decade of organising. Remember that by the time of the first Mardi Gras in the late 70s in Sydney, there was a flourishing gay and lesbian community in Australia. People were very conscious of what was going on in the States, the early reports of a new epidemic. We also had the huge fortune of having a progressive Labor government and a very, very good health minister in Neil Blewett. So the early response to AIDS in Australia was extremely positive, and to, I think, all our surprises, Australia turned out to be one of the 3 or 4 most progressive countries anywhere in responding to the epidemic. The ACT UP moment, which comes later, grew out of a terrible period at the end of the 80s into the early 90s, when considerable numbers of people were dying because the treatments were not available. People were upset, people were angry, people wanted to blame governments, the medical establishment, researchers. In retrospect, while I have deep sympathy with that, I'm not sure there was much to blame. And the reality is that the medical advances in treating HIV, it's still not curable, but we do have drugs that can control and treat, have been extraordinary and quite remarkable. And certainly the resources that were available, while one could always say were not adequate, and if we're talking globally, clearly are not adequate, in a country like Australia were pretty good. Now, having said that, it's also understandable when people are dying, when your friends are dying, when your partners are dying, when your families are disowning you, which is one of the saddest memories I have of that period, of funerals where parents refuse to come because there'd be too many gay men in the chapel. In that environment, of course, there was a huge amount of frustration, of anger, and of activism. And the early 90s was a reborn period of activism around the AIDS crisis.
Also, I'm hearing this for the first time actually, because my reading of that was quite different from yours, and that was that particularly that action was with delays in drugs. But maybe we can all go back to our activist history books and
there were delays in drugs, but in a perfect world, you could say, yes, all that was terrible. But
in the world.
But compared to what was happening in most parts of the world and compared to what has happened with other diseases, I would say Australia did very well. And there is a problem. Some of the pressure to make those early drugs available actually led to people dying. People died because they were put on AZT too quickly and in too large doses. One of my closest friends died on drugs. Yeah. He may well have done better if there had been less pressure to hurry the system. And, you know, you couldn't have said that 20 years ago, but I think we have to be honest and say, you know, activism doesn't always produce the best results. Anger is not necessarily a good way of producing good public policy.
No doubt we'll come back to this conversation again. But speaking about activism, guess we can't ignore today that the biggest issue on the public agenda anyway for GLBT, well, mainly GL people actually, is marriage. And here we have a slide from an archive group in North America who actually speak against equality is the name of their organisation, who are finding that all of this talk of marriage is actually producing a new kind of normativity, which is, you know, if we look at 71 book, the Dennis Altman of then was quite sex positive. So I wonder how you figure from the 71 book to now in terms of the activism around marriage equality.
I think a lot of people know I'm a deep sceptic about the pressure for marriage. I think that the idea that somehow we will deal with all our problems by being allowed to walk down the aisle in maxing tuxedos while the organ plays is a myth. I sometimes think, Carol, you said that it's the biggest issue for many lesbians and gay men. Sometimes I think it's a bigger issue for would-be liberal straights. I had a conversation recently with a very senior former Labor minister who got terribly agitated because Julia Gillard doesn't support same-sex marriage. And here was I in this weird situation of not wanting to defend Julia Gillard, but having to say, look, you know, for me, this is not the number one issue. For me, the number one issue is that in most parts of the world, people who are sexually or gender diverse and diverge from the norm risk being beaten up. If they're women, they often risk what is called, with that extraordinary term, corrective rape, to turn them heterosexual. If they live in a country like Iran, they risk being hung for their sexuality. Those issues to me are huge, and we do live in a global world. And to be honest, I think there is a lot of self-indulgence in the same-sex marriage campaign, which is not interested in, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric about our sisters and brothers, but somehow our sisters and brothers stop at the borders. I'm much more concerned about the fact that our sisters and brothers in many parts of the world are literally facing death and persecution for their sexuality than I am by the fact that in a state where we actually have legal protection as de facto couples, we can't officially be married.
And I could add to that, though, even though there is legal protections, it doesn't stop bullying in schools, for instance, or the way in which, you know, health policy or aged care.
I just want to say one thing. I want to reflect on the fact that Carol and I have become very close friends through these conversations and the conference and a whole lot of things. And one of the things that I have noticed that I think has been absolutely fabulous over the last couple of years is that there is now an openness in the way women and men in our community are talking together. And I've had extraordinary examples where I've been able to go and talk about sex in largely lesbian environments and get an extremely positive reaction.
Not as many seppos these days, right?
Far less, and some of the women who are actually most interested come up to me and say, oh, I love that. Please explain to me about that sauna. Women who 20 years ago would have denounced me for objectification and being a male chauvinist pig. And I think that we have now reached a point where there's some really interesting discussions going on between homosexual women and men that I think is very, very exciting.
Homosexual women, what is that?
Well, I'm sorry, but you know, I also think, and we didn't have time to go into this, there is emerging an extremely interesting new discourse and discussion around gender, around people who have different sorts of views of their gender identity. I don't even want to use the word transgender because that is already, I think, too constrictive of what's going on. And I think we're at a moment in history where a new sort of radicalism is emerging, and that to me is terribly exciting. It's not going to look like the radicalism of the 1970s, and it shouldn't. But I think that we are seeing, particularly with some of the discussion coming from some of the transgender groups, some real challenges to what's taken for granted, which is actually the opposite to the heteronormativity that's implied in the idea that equality is to be measured by the right to get married.
Yes.
We began 40 years ago, and often people say, you know, that was the golden age, radicalism has disappeared, there is no real activism anymore. I think that's a misreading of what's going on at the moment, and I think that some of the discussions and discourses that are going on, particularly around gender, and the whole challenging of binary ideas of gender that we're seeing coming from certain transgender groups. And even the word transgender is probably now too narrow to include all the different sort of formulations of gender and gender and sexuality. That to me is very exciting, and I think we're moving into the possibilities of new types of sexual radicalism, as we should be. It's not going to be a replay of either the gay liberationist period of the 70s or the ACT UP period of the 90s, but it is going to take on a different form, and I look forward, when I'm on my Zimmer frame, to watching that happen.
Well, that's a very hopeful note to end on. Thank you, everybody.